Hello, and welcome to this special late-night session of the Brooklyn Rail's Common Ground. I'm Malva Kajali, Project Assistant here at the Rail, and today I have the pleasure and privilege of welcoming scholars, historians, and cybersecurity experts Eng-Beng Lim, John Chen, and William Beer for a conversation on anti-Asian violence and cybersecurity in this age of Zoom. Ironically, here we are on Zoom. They're joined by curator Hongzheng Han, who will keep them in conversation and in questions. And we're also so lucky to have the poet Enxi Chang, who will read to close today's program for us. So looking forward to that. We've started all our events here with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we're on Lenapehoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. If you'd like to take a moment to share the land you're tuning in from in the chat and some observations on what it's like around you, and I'm going to drop a link to Native Lands CA to make that a little bit easier. Finally, the second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. In the wake of the guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin murder trial just last week, it's hard not to think today about the devastating violence and reach of systemic racism. This includes, of course, 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant, who was shot and killed by the Columbus Police Department just shy of a week ago. When she called them herself in seek of protection. It's devastating to grasp the whole picture of the violence and collective trauma of systemic racism, which we all know too well, across not just individuals, but families, communities, and generations, and to see how little things have changed. Before we open up for our program, I invite you to join us for a brief moment of silence to remember Ma'Khia Bryant. Thank you. And now it's my honor to welcome our wonderful guests of this evening. Professor Eng-Beng Lim is the founding director of the Consortium of Studies in Race, Migration, and Sexuality at Dartmouth, and an associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies as well. He's the author of the national award-winning book, Brown Boys and Rice Queens, Spellbinding Performance in the Asias, which came out just a couple years ago with NYU Press. He's joined by historian, curator, and writer Professor John Chen, who's the inaugural Clement A. Price Chair of Public History and Humanities over at Rutgers, not too far from us, and the director of the Clement Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience. He co-founded the Museum of Chinese in America, where he continues to serve as a senior historian, which we're very excited about. And his recent text, Yellow Peril, an archive of anti-Asian fear, is a critical archival study of images, excerpts, and essays on the history and contemporary impact of paranoia and xenophobia. So glad to have you. Joining them is cybersecurity expert William Beer, whose experiences in cybersecurity span over 30 years on 4 continents. He's a frequent speaker in the global media on high-profile cyber issues, and he is a guest lecturer at a whole host of institutions where he lectures and teaches on cybercrime, cyber strategy, cyber espionage, and the future of cybersecurity. I feel like I'm in like a Spy Kids movie right now. And finally, keeping them in conversation and questions is Hongzheng Han, curator and contemporary art scholar, whose recent curatorial works include Within Global Isolation, Asian Artists in America, Beyond Borders, Art in the Post-COVID Era, and Stuck in Between, Tan Siwan's solo exhibition. They're currently at work on the Asia Society and Museums exhibition for the coming year, Mirror Image, A New View of Chinese Identity. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you. And Hongzhen, take it away.
Hi, guys. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay. Can you guys see it?
Yes.
Okay. Trigger warning. Some language and images can be very offensive and hurtful. Go back to the rice field was one of the many waves of abuse we experienced during a virtual event entitled Finding Queer Radicality in Asian Arts on January 14th, 2021. During this inaugural event for the new series Artesian at the Asian Creative Collective, a group of white supremacists hijacked our screens and defaced our presentation. All the viewers could see was a video of genocide and all one could hear was yelling of gut-wrenching slurs. As the host of this conference, I clenched my fist and readjusted the camera of my laptop with my other trembling hand. I told myself to remain calm, to continue this talk, but as soon as the event was over, I closed my laptop and completely surrendered to the overwhelming feelings of disappointment and despair. How did we get here? As a nation where white supremacists hide behind their computer screens and purposefully search for keywords such as queer or Asian to attack. This experience was not a singular incident. If you Google Zoom bombing, one can quickly find reports of attacks with similar keywords indicating minorities such as Black Caucus or Chinese Student Association. Defined by legal scholar Francis Lee Ansley, white supremacy is, quote, a political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources. Conscious and unconscious ideas of white superiority and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings, end quote. This dichotomy between white and non-white under Trump's unhinged 4-year presidency reached a new peak, manifested in the rising of organizations such as the Proud Boy or QAnon. White supremacists no longer shy away from asserting their political power. On March 31st, 2021, the Carrollton Farmers Branch Independent School District in Texas has placed 3 teachers on administrative leave while it investigates an incident where inappropriate language about Asian Americans was included on a social study test. Now let's take a look at the questions and its use of language. Question 3, which one of these Chinese norms is true? A, it's normal in China to cut off someone's lips if they burp in a restaurant. B, it's normal in parts of China to give children 50 lashes by a cane if they steal a piece of candy. C, it's normal in parts of China to eat cats and dogs. Anti-China propaganda is so deeply rooted in American education and institutions across the board. If you look back to the video recording of the Zoom attack we experienced, you can see that this group of white supremacists are mostly teenagers. In their most impressionable years, they are already taught that people who look like me is the dog-eating yellow peril that deserve to be eliminated. People who look like me are the forever others, or at best, second-class citizen rewarded with the model minority myth. Witnessing and personally experiencing the cruelty of anti-Asian hate crimes, I feel strongly to transform my grief into a source of power that can somehow be educational. Therefore, here I am with the support of the Brooklyn Rail to offer a glimpse of what it's like to be a queer Chinese person living in America. I'm honored to be able to invite 3 panelists to join us today. They are cybersecurity expert, my dear friend, William Beer, professor of ethnic studies, Jack Chen, and professor of women, genders, and sexuality studies, Eng-Beng Lim, to discuss the following subjects. Number 1, the finding of a survival guide for people of color in the age of Zoom and Zoom attacks. Number 2, America's long history of scapegoating its Asian citizens. And last, queer Asian radicality and its intersectionality. Before I proceed with my questions, I would like to pay an homage to Brooklyn Rail's beautiful tradition of memorializing the victims of the unjust. Let's please take a moment of silence to remember all these victims of the Atlanta shooting. Thank you. Now I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, my first question is for Professor Chen. According to Madeleine Wise-Su, quote, the earliest American law concerning citizenship, the Nationality Act of 1790, has set aside Asians as racially ineligible. The earliest enforced immigration laws between 1875 to 1943 has targeted Chinese by race, who thereby became the first illegal immigrants against whom the legal and institutional foundations of American border controls were established, end quote. Can you give us a brief run through of the history of anti-Asian sentiments and laws in America? And can you also introduce us with the concept of the classic Anglo-American Protestant paranoid and its relationship with yellow peril?
I will try to do it briefly, but this is deep, deep, deep within the Anglo-American tradition and the Western European tradition. So it's important to acknowledge the Naturalization Act of 1790, but it's really, which really was about saying that white males could be citizens, and whiteness itself was under contestation. But it really needs to be embedded in the deeper kind of framing in which Anglo-American citizenship was formulated. So we need to go back, for example, to John Locke and look at the way in which he had formulated citizenship as life, liberty, and property, which of course got transmuted by Jefferson into life, liberty, and happiness. But part of the notion of property was really the ability of self-ownership. And the thought within the Protestant perspective was that Catholics were not capable of doing that. It was the Pope, who commanded them to vote a certain way, so they could not be reliable in terms of self-ownership as a citizen who would act on their own individual behalf. But that, of course, is also applied towards African-American bodies and indigenous peoples, so that the dispossession of Native American lands, in which Native Americans were seen as part of nature, not as stewarding nature, not as actually in harmony, working alongside nature, but because they were part of nature, they weren't considered actively cultivating the land and therefore being distinguishing themselves from other creatures, and therefore really were just ripe for dispossession. I think there's a lot of knowledge at the time that that was not entirely true. There was certainly an awareness among the colonists, the settler colonists of the Dutch and the British, that the indigenous people were farming the land. They were cultivating the land. They were planting trees for nuts and other kinds of things. But that was a very convenient way in which dispossession could happen. And under the name of extractivism and global trade, there's also, of course, the first moves for enslavement. And we tend not to know that history in the New York, New Jersey region, and think somehow this is a Southern phenomenon, think somehow that it was the Western indigenous peoples, but we really need to reconstruct what that history is about. But we also have to go back to the popes, a number of popes, reinforcement of the doctrine of discovery, which is really the claiming that if you plant the flag of Christendom onto any heathen lands, then therefore they could be claimed. So we're talking about a combination of Christendom, but also later on Anglo-American Protestant notions of what ownership and private property would embody. So I think when we get back to notions of who counts as citizens and who doesn't, it was automatically racially defined. And I think the way in which Asians come into this mix of racialization is really particularly peculiar to Asian Americans. So we tend to think of racism as all the same, but we have to think of course, indigeneity in terms of land, African Americans in terms of enslaved bodies. But Asian Americans were really thought in terms of things, especially because it was the China trade initially, but the trade across Asia that really drove so many of the relationships that were first established during this colonial period. So in many ways, Chinese things were both coveted and wanted and desired as items of luxury and ways of identifying the user, George Washington, for example, or Benjamin Franklin, or any of those folks. But it was also a way of really thinking about things made beautifully and luxuriously in a way that Europeans could not, but also copies and things that could be made cheaply. So we've got the legacy of that particular form of racialization, which has to do with foreign policy, immigration policy, border controls, which is different than, of course, indigenous and African-American Black racialization. So it's really to say that these patterns form at the very beginning of the nation. And as we know, once patterns are deeply ingrained in the political culture of a nation, it's actually very hard to shake. At the same time, there's been contestation throughout. It's never been a passive acceptance of those kinds of dispossession, enslavement, nor for that matter, the thingification of Asian bodies as well. And there's always been pushback. There's always been people speaking back. But in many ways, those stories have tended to be not made public, not published, not considered legitimate, not having faculty who were able to write back and speak back until really quite recently. So we are talking about moments of reconstruction in which the culminating resistance and pushing back have resulted in moments in which structural change is possible. And of course, we're talking about the radical reconstruction after the Civil War. We're talking about the reconstruction of the civil rights movement. But I believe now we're also in a major reconstructive moment. And just to respond to that question about Anglo-American paranoia, it's really something that I think is premised on the incredibly rigid notions of Calvinism, especially as it got practice in the United States and became rooted in the United States. It had to do with a disciplining of the Protestant relationship to God, and that it was also a way in which the body and the spirit were turned into basically instruments of production. So of course we know of Weber's idea of Protestantism and the spirit of capitalism. So as opposed to the spirit of religion, he's talking about the spirit of capitalism. What is it that drives that internal disciplining in which dancing, pleasure, those kinds of things that are natural, if we're going to say anything is natural to human bodies and all living creatures in terms of wanting to live a full life, but disciplining and denying oneself those basics also create this sense of the internal other, the alienated other, but also projecting that out into an external other. And there becomes a bad object, but also a romanticized object. This is a more complicated kind of discussion, but it's really to say that I think these dynamic sociological, cultural, and political dynamics are deep within the Anglo-American cultural being. And therefore, all those who don't fit within that, Catholics, people of color, heathens, all of these categories that are created, and certainly women and other gender identified groups, right, don't fit in within these normal categories. And I'll just say maybe one more thing, is that this becomes codified, especially during the period of US progressivism, in which reeling from the extremes of wealth building and impoverishment that happened in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, you also get the emergence of eugenics. And eugenics is really part of scientific racism. And it has a deep legacy into the dispossession and enslavement and kind of extractive trade dynamics of the founding of the nation. But they continue to this day, if we're to look at the ways in which algorithms, big data, the Human Genome Project continue to have the garbage data that's entered into them with the false assumptions of hierarchies of racism's values, and also embodied otherness, right? So we're really talking about a deeply entrenched legacy in which moments of pushback and moments of reconstruction are critical to really liberating humanity and the others within ourselves, but the way in which we project danger and disease onto other bodies as well.
Thank you so much for this enlightening answer. It's a perfect opening for our entire talk. My second question goes for Professor Lim. In your book, Brown Boys and Rice Queens, you analyzed Frank Chin's 1972 play, The Chicken Coop China, and its central character, Tom Lam's admiration and imagination of the Lone Ranger as a Chinese man in disguise to bring revenge to the West. This is one of the many examples you used to describe the diet of white man and Asian boy. For the viewers who aren't really familiar with this dichotomy, can you tell us more about it, as well as the historical exclusion of Asian male from Western normative masculinity?
Sure. Thank you so much, Hongzheng. First of all, thanks to Brooklyn Rail for hosting this event and to Hongzheng for inviting me. I'm outraged that you have had to suffer racialized Zoom bombing, and I'm so glad that you're turning that experience into a teachable moment, and I'm very glad to be part of the talk back with you. Regarding your question about the ways in which we might understand Asian American masculinity, one of the things that Professor Jack Chen talked about was the ways in which Asian Americans were seen as objects, things. And one of the ideas that we could develop from the thingification of Asian Americans is how they are seen as miniaturized objects, such as pets or things that are cute. And one of the lasting images from the post-World War II era is General MacArthur holding on to a Japanese wind-up doll in traditional garb. And what we can think through with this very iconic image is the differentiation whenever the white man is paired with the Asian male. That is, when whereas one is seen as having gravitas, is an adult, and is authoritative, has a biography, is a star, is desirable. The other is bound by tradition, rigid, full of mischief, and subject to tutelage and schooling. So this pairing, which is of course a part of the colonial disciplining of bodies, has a lot of ramifications in the ways that we understand Asian masculinities in the West in particular, and the thingification of Asian Americans in the West is part of the Orientalist idea, in which the East and the West are always bifurcated in terms of how one is forever subject. One is always already the object, and the other is always already a subject. So this positions the Asian American male as the castrated Asian, which is a very famous work by Professor David Eng, and the queer racialization of Asian American masculinity is a performative trope that has been very influential in the ways that art encounters, sexuality, positionalities, and ideas are conceived, both culturally and ethnographically, conceptually, sexually, and so forth. So the diet that I study in the book is a way for us to think through how, on the one hand, you have toxic masculinity from the colonial intimacy project that has defined Asian American, Asian male as always already, less than the proper and desirable masculinity of his white counterpart. And this is the coercive forms of normative gender role play that are mandated whenever the white man meets the Asian male. And part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to queer this encounter and to think about how we might understand this differently in encounters and relationalities that are produced from contexts that are other than coercive and colonial. How might we understand the possibilities of queer relationalities that engages but also exceed that conception? So I'll just leave it right there. I just wanted to use that as a framework for us to think about how we can think about the critique of colonial toxic masculinity, and at the same time, figure out how queer versions of that gender imaginary might be contested and re-signified. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your answer reminds me of this incident in 1902. Then American Federation of Labor President Samuel Gompers, in his effort to renew the 1882 and 1892 Chinese Exclusion Act, he used a very interesting analogy that America is the meat and Asian are the rice. And this idea of thingification is pretty much very telling from this interesting antidote, which is actually quite horrific. My next question is for William. As I mentioned earlier in my short presentation, that racist Zoom bombing has become almost a norm for people of color. In the age of endless Zoom meetings, how can people of color just better protect themselves?
Well, it's a great question. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. It's such an important topic, not just the cyber piece, but obviously the bigger. And if cyber can play a role to help protect and render, the conversations more robust and more secure, so be it. So I'm happy to share some ideas. I think, first of all, it's important to point out that we all have a role to play when we think about cybersecurity in our daily lives. Oftentimes, when we close our door, when we come into our houses and we lock the door, we think we're secure. But in this day and age, with high-speed internet and Wi-Fi, those doors and windows are open all the time. And we need to think about how our own behavior can impact our security when we do anything online. And oftentimes, that's one of the first things that I speak to people about, because we need to reflect differently about our security in a highly connected age that we're in. Clearly, Zoom had some failings. And to their credit, they came out in about 2012 initially when they first started to produce their software. But it was quite clear at the beginning of the pandemic that there were some shortcomings in terms of security and privacy in the credit, they addressed them quite quickly. So a lot of the features that we're dealing with today, the waiting room, hidden links, et cetera, have been done after some of the problems began to occur. But obviously, Zoom isn't the only platform out there as well. There's WebEx, there's BlueJeans, the list Teams, the list goes on and on and on. And so I think that we need to be very careful that we just don't, Zoom bash, right? Because other platforms have problems And two, that we all accept our own personal responsibility for our security in cyberspace. And that means, I think, becoming a little more cyber savvy. We all need to think about the settings that exist in the different programs that we use, make sure that our computers are up to date, have as many security settings or additional security packages as possible turned on and set up. And I think that those actions themselves will contribute to better security and better protect us. But the other thing that I think is inevitable, we need to reflect on, is the concept of cyber resiliency. You know, if you were to lose your credit card right now, you probably know what to do. You know who to call and what to do. And I think we also need to be prepared or resilient in cyberspace as well. So think about, you know, what would we do if this call got bombed right now? Who would take responsibility, and have we prepared or thought it through? And by thinking a little ahead, I think we can be better prepared and more resilient for the future. And hopefully those couple pointers will help everyone tonight.
Thank you so much. You were just saying that becoming more resilient. In fact, after the Zoom bombing, we reached out to Zoom, Event Tribe. We even called the FBI, the police department. The answer were quite disappointing. They really couldn't do anything. So my following question is there really a way for Zoom, Google Hangout, all these platforms to trace back to the perpetrator of the hate crime? Is there a way for the FBI or the police department to find these people and hold them accountable? The title of this talk is Age of No Consequences, because it is the age of no consequences. There are so many of these incidents that are happening across the globe, actually, but nothing really tangible is happening. So what can we do?
Yeah, and that's another great question and a difficult one to answer. I think we need to go back a little bit in time, similar to what the other speakers were talking about, to be able to answer that question. And the internet, you know, the foundations were laid in the 1960s, and it was designed to be very resilient and to be able to withstand a nuclear attack. And because of the way the internet was designed, and because of the fact that there was not a lot of security built into it from day one, even to this day, so many years later, it's very, very difficult to look at attribution, because the question you're asking in technical terms is attribution. Can I attribute a certain action on the internet back to an individual? Generally speaking, it's easier to attribute to an IP address, so the specific address at your computer is given when you connect. But to work out who's behind that last yard, right? So who's behind the last yard from the computer screen to the keyboard, and who's actually perpetrating it, that's extremely difficult. It is possible to trace people back, but it becomes a legal issue and a law enforcement issue, and it can be quite costly. But what I would say, Han, I think it's very important, despite the fact that you didn't necessarily get a good result, it's so important to log these with law enforcement, because that helps produce good statistics, that helps produce good data, and that cannot be ignored. When the data gets to a certain point, hopefully we'll have better action and better results from law enforcement. So not a great answer for you, but at least hopefully a little more background information around why that's happening.
Thank you. Thanks. My next question is for Professor Chan. In 1976, the Asia Society published a report entitled Asia in American Textbooks, in which it found that American textbooks were mostly Eurocentric, quote, portraying Asia as catching up with the West. Here is an excerpt from the textbook Living World, published in 1974 by Scott Forsman, quote, in the 20th century, the people of Asia and Africa have come alive. They have adopted the nationalistic creeds, the democratic ideas, and the modern science of the West, and they have demanded freedom from imperial rules, end quote. In combination with the racist social study that I mentioned earlier, can you tell us about the educational system in America and how its Eurocentrism might be a strong fundamental support for the growth of white supremacy?
Another great question that deserves a lot of time. I'll try to be really brief. I think it really goes back to this question of what really what I would say is a founding mythic teleology of this country, which has a certain kind of progress narrative to it, and that there's a kind of unidimensional way in which human progress can happen, and that there are classification systems and hierarchies that distance the human from nature and the kind of hierarchy within the natural order, but then also the hierarchy within those who are more superior humans to those who are more inferior humans. So that kind of classification system is so hardwired into the way, for example, museums operate, the way anthropology has been set up, the way data systems have been created, that it really becomes part of the air that we breathe. So in a sense, another way of saying that, it's part of the political culture, and textbooks, books in general, museums, all these systems are really part of that broader political culture. Now, it's not to say that's always determinative, but of course, those founding institutions and those founding kinds of logics that are embedded are very hard once they're established into the foundations of the society to change. So there's always kind of a pushback, and there's always a kind of default in which the conventional foundational assumptions are easily kind of reasserting themselves unless there's a consistent kind of organizing. So I think part of the answer to this question, both in terms of the kind of cyberspace and also in terms of particularities of textbooks, for example, is that there has to be massive popular organizing. I think it's very hard to simply give our trust to the state or some benevolent decision makers, in which we, of course, now have more kind of structured hierarchical decision-making processes in our society, in part because of the new era of technological kind of ways in which our lives are so formed. And of course, this is all part of it. And of course, with Zoom, for example, we also have the possibility of communicating and pushing back and organizing in ways that are unprecedented as well. So we just can't be simply thinking of this as a simple process of being against Orientalism and somehow being able to just achieve that. But it takes massive organizing and popular engagement to really be able to do that. It's difficult, but I also believe that it's something that we can do and change can actually happen. And that it's a matter of reaching that tipping point in which if enough of us are really understanding and aware of how to grapple with these things and how to grapple with kind of the, but also in a deeper way. So I think when Eng-Beng was talking about, heteronormativity and kind of a toxic masculinity, and if we understand that in terms of kind of a deep Anglo-American kind of Protestant kind of fragility that is also constituent of white supremacy, then I think we begin to understand what the complex intersectional nature of that political culture is and how to push it in very different ways at very different points. And I think there are weaknesses in all that. So I think there's ways of pushing back. So to answer more directly your question after that long kind of context, is that things have changed. That was done a number of decades ago, and there are far more people now involved who are people of color, who are also people of goodwill, who want to get at a more accurate and more rigorous way of understanding what the civic and cultural contestations are in a society such as this. And there are many, many more people now pushing back. Now, it doesn't mean that simply if you are a person of color and you get some kind of award or book award or some kind of an honored position, that that's enough. It's not a matter of inclusion or increased quote unquote rights to be included into that system. But it's really saying that I think it's really people who have been most victimized, let's say in the case of eugenics, those who are differently abled who are also Black, let's say, and have been absolutely really attacked by the heteronormative standards of the mainstream society. Those people will have the deepest, most critical insights about how to push back. So I think there's a variety of ways in which we all have different kinds of insights depending on what part of the intersections we are in. And there are ways of making the changes that in some ways we're unique in terms of understanding. So I think by having more people writing, having more people performing, having more people doing all sorts of different things, including coding, including pushing back in all these areas, that's really how the change begins to accumulate a critical mass to really happen. But we have to also be analyzing together and critiquing together so we have some sense of what it is that we're trying to push back against. That's a very vague answer, but hopefully it gives some sense that we can make these changes and it's already happening.
Thank you. That's a very hopeful answer. And I hope that we are really at the watershed moment where we can see real change. The next question is for William still, because this question is still related to the education. New York Times recent article, Feeding Hate with Video, talks about how a former alt-right activist, Tommy Robinson, and his strategy in creating extremist propaganda. Quote, focus on conflict, feed the algorithm, make sure whatever you produce reinforces a narrative. Don't worry if it's true, end quote. Misinformation and fake news created by these extremists are the major reason why BIPOC, queer, and immigrants are facing increasing danger. In this digital age dominated by computer algorithm, how can we be factually informed? How can we, as critical thinkers, to gain better judgment and not be manipulated by propagandist education?
Well, another wonderful question, and it could go into many, many different directions. Again, maybe a little bit of background just to set the scene. I think one of the failings of the cybersecurity industry right now is that we're not focused enough on the integrity of information, okay? When we talk about cybersecurity, we normally talk about three things: confidentiality of information, and quite frankly, we're doing a pretty good job there, protecting people's information. Integrity, we'll come back to that, and availability. And availability, we're doing a pretty good job. So when you think about, you go to a website, generally speaking, you know it's going to be up and running and you can read it, you can access it, and you're pretty confident about their ability to protect your information. However, the industry has not focused enough on integrity. So how do we know that that information that I'm seeing is actually what it really is? And that's where I think the industry has an incredible amount of work to do. I do not think the industry has come up with a good solution yet, but I think to a certain degree, as we begin to focus on the I letter, technology will help us. And so I think that another portion or another problem we're going to have to face is the whole concept of identity. You know, if I ask you what your identity is, you probably think about your driver's license or your passport to establish your identity. And quite frankly, those systems are dated and they are not helping us establish our identity with confidence and with trust when we do any sort of transaction on the internet. So I think that those are two massive issues that the industry is still grappling with. But as we begin to explore and release and experiment with solutions that help establish better digital identity and help focus on the integrity of the information that's published or produced on the internet, the situation will begin to improve. But the other interesting thing is, you may have heard of Alan Turing, who was a famous British mathematician. And you may notice in certain websites, when you're clicking, you're asked to click on bridges, or you're asked to click here to prove that you're a human. That goes back to some of his great work that was done in the 50s, the well-known Turing test. And I think by applying some of those principles to deep fakes or some of the challenges we're facing with regards to integrity on the internet, the situation will improve. So much more work to be done, Han. I think, again, it goes back to what I said in your previous question, which is we're very naive when we do things online. A lot of people are overly confident or just trust people or trust things that they see online. They're closing their doors, they're in their home, and they trust it. That's something that I think we all need to reflect on. We need to raise our level of vigilance and be more security aware. And that will help in the meantime until we have better solutions defined and ready.
Thank you. Fun fact about Alan Turing, the father of computer, is he's also gay. He's also queer. So gay people change the world.
And he was recently pardoned as well.
Long overdue.
Indeed, indeed.
The former Cherokee County Sheriff spokesperson, Jay Baker, has famously claimed the white terrorist action in Atlanta shooting was, quote, he apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction, and sees these locations as something that allows him to go to these places, and it's a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate. Yesterday was a very bad day for him, end quote. Besides the emasculation of Asian men, the invention of the hypersexualization of Asian women in America also serves white supremacy well. From movies such as Full Metal Jacket by Stanley Kubrick to Mean Girls by Tina Fey, Asian women are considered as the submissive, me-so-horny type of object that is destined to be dominated and abused by white men. We also have respected academics like Harvard professor J. Mark Ramsayer publicly denouncing the legitimacy of the brutal history of Korean/Chinese comfort women during World War II. Asian women remain the easy manipulation of white men. Thinking about intersectionality, can Professor Lim educate us the importance of understanding feminist and queer theory in discussing white supremacy?
Hongzheng, that's a great question. And there's several ways to think about this question, and it's tied to the last two questions. And so far as we are thinking about the pedagogies of white supremacy and how might we undo and unmake white supremacist imaginary thinking practices and so forth, I think it's important, first of all, to understand that white supremacy is not monolithic, and that we need to approach the question of white supremacy as a formation with different genealogies. In other words, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Latinx racism, anti-Native racism have different historical trajectories that are related to US imperialism, foundational events like Native genocide, the transatlantic slave trade, and so forth. So it's really crucial to begin by noting how we need to parse the nuances and the different lineages of white supremacy. Having said that, the examples that you give have to do with how we understand the links between US imperialism and wars in Asia to the ways that Asian American and Asian femininities and masculinities are disciplined in the US. So we have to make that link in order to think through how it is come to be that this tropic spell, as I've conceptualized in my first book, continues to be reproduced across time and place. In terms of thinking about feminist and queer theories, it's also very important to foreground how proximate supremacies function even within feminist and queer thinking, so that carceral feminism and homo-nationalist thinking, which are fundamentally aligned with predatory capitalism, with the military-industrial complex, with with state policies and juridical structures do not necessarily provide a way for us to combat white supremacy. They in fact subscribe, if unconsciously, to the very logics of white supremacy. So how might we then identify and undo the premises and tendencies of white supremacist thinking is part of the question here. So it isn't so much about expressing outrage at the violation that's happened, but really to fundamentally question how it is that we've come to accept and just internalize some of these logics. So one way to think about this question is to approach it as a epistemic and political project to decolonize our thinking, and to approach it as not just an intersectional issue, but also a queer issue. How will we think through the complexity of all of these practices and thinking that push back at any one monolithic idea of what white supremacy is, and to push back at the mainstream regurgitation of these ideas, especially in the press.
Thank you for your answer. I think for a lot of queer people living in America, especially queer people of color, if you use any kind of social media, you might have experienced people, especially white gay men, straight passing white gay men, saying no Asian, no blacks, which is inherently white supremacist. So it ties to what you said, that even within our community, there are a group of people that their ideology are aligned with white supremacist ideology. I would like to continue talk about institutional racism that Professor Chen just mentioned earlier, such as museums or universities. Let's do university first. Harvard is being asked harshly today. Harvard University's Counseling and Mental Health Service had originally sent out the resources to address the rise of anti-Asian biases and attacks since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic. The now deleted message read, when you experience racism, you can feel shame. You may wish that you were not Asian. But remember, your ancestor likely went through similar or even worse incidents. Professor Chen, how can a prestigious school like Harvard be so bluntly stupid?
Well, I guess it depends on how we want to define intelligence, and whether Harvard really is the bastion of all knowledge and enlightenment. We have to look at these things historically as constructions of bastions of intelligence, which are premised on certain kinds of racial hierarchies and certain notions of who has the inherited supremacy that then constructs people on top. Now, even an institution like Harvard has been contested in terms of who's to be admitted. We can understand that in retrospect in terms of, let's say, Jews who were absolutely kept out of major white Anglo-Saxon Protestant institutions. And they were not only just saying we have to be included, but the whole system of curriculum, the whole construction of a Protestant curriculum, for example, that created certain kinds of facts and certain kinds of correct answers, that itself had to be destabilized and contested. So we're talking about waves of that kind of contestation of what a place like Harvard can understand as what its superior position is. That's about archives, it's about classification systems, it's about the assumptions that the separated units within the university as departments and specialists within universities in some ways have to kind of coordinate within certain assumptions of Western Enlightenment itself. Now, the Western Enlightenment paradigm is only a partial understanding of really how that quote unquote civilization has been constructed. The other side of that is really certainly colonialism. And that has to be understood as a twin process. So it's also to say that intelligence measurements, and the structure of meritocracy that Ivy League schools have continued to be able to ride in terms of the dominant position, really through wealth and power, is itself changing over time, morphing over time, necessarily having to adjust and having to incorporate groups that it considered inferior and not worthy at different times. So that kind of notion of irreproachability and legitimacy itself has to be examined historically. I would just recommend, for example, that people look at Craig Wilder's fantastic book, Ebony and Ivory, which is really looking at the ways in which Ivy League schools have really constructed their wealth and power, and therefore their sense of superiority and invincibility, really through the enslavement and the profits of the enslavement process. But we can add, just linked to what I talked about earlier, land grant colleges, but also private universities benefit from the dispossession of lands. And also we understand that trade and the China trade and the opium trades were also early contributors to these very early colonial and very elite institutions. So once we understand the bases of materiality of these places, we also understand the construction in which these hierarchies of supposed intelligence and enlightenment classifications really are also constructed in the same way. So I really think that in some ways we shouldn't be surprised that a place like Harvard would say these things, because in fact, it exposes, in fact, the ignorance that's really there. And that there's so much absurdity and silliness. Once we give these statements and give these classification systems a larger context. So I'm just going to throw in a couple of other obvious things, such as the usage of the Mongoloid idiots as a way to describe folks with Down syndrome, for example, right? So that was all part of a larger kind of eugenics logic of degeneration. So that somehow that somebody with Mongoloid idiocy was having a degenerative kind of devolutionary kind of experience in their bodies, in which they were devolving from a perfectly superior white person to an inferior racial state as a Mongoloid, right? So that's just one example, but also, of course, when we think of the term slophead, which was used in the Vietnam War as a reference to the enemy soldiers, but also used during the US war in the Philippines. These kinds of terms have deep kind of Western scientific racist framings that have to do with physiognomy, that have to do with notions that somehow the shape of the skull and the slope of the skull has to do with intelligence, and that of course we have the notion that it's really the white man who has the highest forehead. So, you know, our culture, I mean, this is a phrenological head, right, in which the bumps of the skull are meant to correspond to certain kinds of qualities of one person. And we can say that these practices may have changed in terms of what we think of it, what's acceptable in terms of measures of intelligence. But again, the contemporary measures are also highly constructed. So there's a kind of actually frailness and a silliness if we actually put these in the larger context, and we have many more people included in terms of who is genuinely human, and also we kind of reconnect this separation between humans and nature as well. And I think we're at a moment in which we have to understand, given the way in which global warming is basically, and the human involvement in making global warming happen, we have to realize that this notion that somehow we're more than nature and that we're independent from nature is really the most silly thing of all, and the kind of blind pursuit of wealth and poverty, despite all of this evidence to the contrary, of course, falls on the shoulders of the least least powerful and least wealthy people. But it's also a crazy notion that somehow the elites are going to be able to buy those properties in the mountaintops of New Zealand and go to the Mars and save themselves. So this silliness, this absurdity, is still extremely operative amongst the most elite and so-called most successful and most intelligent people of our society.
Thank you for your answer. My next question is for William. You were interviewed by BBC about the US government's indictment of 2 Chinese hackers. When questioned about the Chinese hackers, your answer to BBC was rather neutral. You suggested that international espionage is ubiquitous. Everybody is doing it. In fact, on March 3rd, 2020, the Chinese cybersecurity company Qihu 360 accused CIA of having hacked many Chinese companies over 11 years. Do you think that there will be, or there is already, cyber warfare between China and America?
Well, another good question. I'll take a deep breath. I mean, it's a very loaded question and very sensitive, especially, obviously when you're speaking to a global audience on the BBC. I personally believe, with regards to cybersecurity, there has been so much China bashing, and almost immediately people point the finger and say, okay, there was an attack. Was it China? Was it China? And they allude to the fact that it potentially was. It goes back again to what I was saying at the beginning of this session, which is attribution is so very difficult, okay? So it's very difficult to point the finger and say with certainty a specific attack came from a specific country. And if a government points out that it did, the hope is that they've done their homework and they've got a good case before they declare that. But I would say, Han, that it is clear that cyber warfare has become commonplace. It exists without a doubt. It exists between many nations. And the irony of the famous WikiLeaks event, which took place many years ago, was that when we started to look at the WikiLeaks files, it was clear that there were a lot of nations that were deeply, deeply involved in cyber espionage, cyber warfare. So it is quite common. And I think it's important to point out, it's not just being led by the nation states themselves, but it is sometimes happening by being led by private corporations. So it's a widespread problem. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to end anytime soon. I do think we're in a bit of an arms race, and organizations, countries are looking to primarily steal IP, intellectual property, to speed up their own economic development. But I think if we think about protection of individual nations, they are also looking towards cyber means to protect themselves or to fight back, because it's much more cost effective. And it doesn't necessarily put human lives on the front line. However, I think it's inevitable that death will result of cyber warfare. It's something that concerns me greatly. I recall back in 2012, I wanted to talk about the concept of cyber death at a large government conference in the United Kingdom. And the organizers said, William, while we believe that it's going to be a reality, it is quite morbid, and it's probably a little premature to speak about this in a public forum. But I think when you start to see large amounts of people dying because of a cyber-related incident, that's when I think governments, the United Nations, and other bodies will really sit up and hopefully begin to address it. And that's just the way of the world. It makes me very sad to think that people will have to die before we take concrete action and we really begin to focus on it properly. But I think that's probably what will happen.
Yeah, that's a very roomy answer. And when I personally experienced the cyber attack from the white supremacists, when they broadcasted the genocide, I thought I was going to be killed.
Yeah.
As dramatic as it is, I really thought so. Anyway, let's move on. Professor Lim, in your book Brown Boys and Rice Queen, you mentioned, quote, Asia has come to be a category for a particular approach to queer studies that seeks to reify intra-Asian connection, often from a deracialized vantage point that ignores or even disparages Asian diasporic and migration links to the West, end quote. It echoes scholar Patrice Lu's claim on how Western queer theorists seek new outlet for queer radicality, particularly in Asia, due to the growing homonormativity in the West. Can you talk a little bit about this so very desired queer radicality in Asian culture, Asian art, Asian literature? You're mute.
You know, Hongzheng, this question of radicality is a very fraught question. I mean, what constitutes radical in terms of art practice? I'd love to hear your thoughts and the thoughts of the readers of Brooklyn Rail to get in on this really monumental debate. And what you set up here as the question is a broader academic debate about the state of thinking race and ethnicity vis-a-vis area studies alongside US ethnic studies. So I don't think I want to rehearse the academic debate here because it seems like we're getting into the weeds a bit by parsing how it is that I've come to set up this question in the book. But I think what would be very useful for us to think about is how might we think through the problems of liberalism in precisely the way that you frame the question, and how queer radicality in Asian art comes to be the cipher for disengaging with some of the questions that are central to queer studies, Asian American studies, which, by the way, is a pan-ethnic coalitional project. Asia is so large. If you think about it, how could you even figure out a homogeneous conception of Asia or Asia America for that matter? So I would say that if we were to follow the logics of this question, then we might fall into the trap of liberal thinking that mandates how we might understand cultural production based on paradigms of identity and representation, rather than holding very closely what is at stake when you practice what you deem to be a radical set of politics. So rather than a description of a genre, I'm more interested in thinking with you about how we might conceptualize, practice radicality as decolonial, intersectional, and queer practice. How do we do that? And I think that in many ways is the spirit of this question and this whole setup, where we are interweaving so many different routes of thinking. I have never been on a panel with someone like William Veer, which is fantastic to hear his perspective about how we might understand those very intersections, right, on in terms of technologies and in terms of how these ways of thinking could potentially intersect. So I'm going to leave it right there, and I'd love to engage with you more.
Thank you so much. Before we move on to the Q&A, please bear with me with an ending statement. On April 21st, 2021, which is exactly a week ago, the Senate passed a bill to combat the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes. This bill was almost bipartisan besides Missouri Senator Josh Hawley's veto. Remember this name. I was thrilled to hear about the news until a further investigation. One major component of this bill is to encourage law enforcement prevention, training, and education on hate crimes. It sounds great, but the result of this reinforcement of policing might be just another tactic of the model minority myth to further oppress other minority groups. Another takeaway from this swift passing of the bill is to realize how minority groups in America are treated differently. The Black and Brown community have been suffering from hate crimes and police brutality since the beginning of time. And the entire Black Lives Matter movement is to call for governmental actions to protect Black Americans. But did anything tangible happen? Did any bill got passed? From what we learned today, it is not irresponsible to claim that white supremacy is inherently anti-Black and anti-women. It's important for us, the Asian community and the white allies, to realize that this is not a pick and choose game. We have to be all in when it comes to defeating white supremacy, and supporting our Black and Brown community should be the priority. American author Audre Lorde famously claimed that, quote, "I'm not free when any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own," end quote. Exactly, no one is liberated until everyone is liberated. Black Lives Matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hongzheng. And thank you, Eng-Beng. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Jack. This has been fantastic. I hope you come back and curate another one of these, because this has been like just fantastic. Thank you all for your contributions. We have a number of questions lined up. I'm hoping perhaps a few more might trickle in from the audience while we're in the midst of these ones. But our first question will come from our very own Nick Bennett. And Nick, you can turn on your microphone at will.
Thank you. I want to thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Hongzheng, for putting this together so thoughtfully. It's interesting. I posted this question in the chat a while back, a few minutes ago, but it's interesting that in your closing statement you kind of touched on it. My question is maybe directed for you first, Hongzheng. If there was one single action that could be passed by our current administration to not just acknowledge, but to counter this sort of specifically anti-Asian hate, but generally domestic terrorism, what would that be for you? What would that one action, in your opinion, be sort of a catalyst for greater change?
That's a great question, and thank you so much for always being so supportive. The simple answer is defunding the police. Police department has been inherently a racist department that are overfunded. They have enough money already. What we need to do is to relocate those fundings to, for example, counselors, psychiatrists, to de-escalate conflicts rather than just pull out a gun and kill them and have no consequences. I am not an expert in politics, but I'm also not an American yet. But this is something that I would really advocate, because police brutality against Black bodies, Black Americans, needs to stop. It's ridiculous. Thanks.
Wondering if perhaps we could pass this question around to everyone. You know, what do you think are, if you had to sort of advocate for one best tangible action to come down from an administrative level to counter sort of like anti-Asian discrimination, violence, racially motivated attacks, that kind of domestic terrorism, like what would it be?
Well, maybe I'll just quickly jump in. I've been listening to a lot of Noam Chomsky lately, talking about questions of how do you deal with global warming, and the question of whether capitalism can be defeated before global warming kicks in and destroys us all. But the same could be said about this in terms of decolonization and anti-racism. So for me, I think, as he was saying, we have to massively invest in public and popular education, in terms of museums that are responsive to these questions, in terms of public scholars, in terms of publications, because I think the challenge of this particular society is really to not just have educated elites who know better somehow, but have a broad, massive public understanding that builds into some kind of broad, massive public opinion, but also not just voting, ways in which progressive policies that have been de-eugenicized, because eugenics was a part of the progressive era, right? De-eugenicized ways of understanding and more rigorous ways of thinking about who is human, who is more than human, and the relationships with nature at large. Until we get to that point, we don't have enough leverage to make a substantial change happen. So I think we have to kind of work that paradox and really try to get as much investment into these popular forms of rigorous education and publicity as possible.
If I could just build on that, I mean, I fully agree. I think that governments, if they want to think about widespread communications, are probably the best place to do so. And I think that oftentimes what we hear is after an incident, we hear individual or groups of politicians or actors or actresses at an awards night talking about a specific problem. But I truly believe that if the government really wanted to use its power with communication experts, behavioral psychologists, to send messages to the population that resonate really, really well, I think they could move the needle and begin to make a difference. I mean, if you think about things like, and I know it's a slightly dated example, but even things like seatbelts. People didn't used to wear seatbelts, and the government managed to convince people about the importance of that. And so I think by really thinking this through carefully and putting the full power of a government behind it, public awareness campaigns about racism could begin to move the needle. But we haven't seen massive public awareness campaigns. We've seen individuals speak out about it, and I think that that might make a difference.
I'm going to jump in, you guys. Thank you, Hongzheng. Thank you, William, and Ben, and Jack. It's been a very profound conversation. I'm sorry I just gonna have to go to a dinner meeting, but I was thinking about this predicament for the longest time. I remember once in the late 80s, I have a chance to have long conversation, a dinner conversation with Irvin Howe. And Irvin asked me about Vietnam and everything else because, you know, his generation fought very hard. That whole entire generation, I mean, Noam Chomsky is one of the few who went to the academy, but never gave up the public work, ever. He, in fact, was in our NSE from the very beginning. And I think that's a terrible, you know, incredible tragedy when the war in Vietnam ended in 1975. All the leftist intellectual, the progressive, the great of them all, felt the greatest discouragement. It was a whole psychological blow. You know, when they discover 1 million Vietnamese were killed, 300 more thousand American was also killed. Basically, the American lost the war. And what I was talking to Irvin about the specificness, because we were talking about iconography. And I was telling him, when you look at the image of Buddha, Irvin, he's there trying to reach nirvana, which is not being there whatsoever, as opposed to this very sexualized image of Christ on the cross with incredible gravity of suffering. If you were to make art, which one is more dramatic? Which one will be compelling most viewership? you know? So it's interesting. To me, the thing have changed. If, you know, those who have been colonized, those countries like Vietnam, India, you know, elsewhere in the world really, to be educated is to be assimilated into the Enlightenment system, Jack. Absolutely. Because I know members of my family who speak better French than Parisian people. Same thing that I know a lot of Indian friends who went to Oxford, speak better English than a lot of British people do. It's very insane, you know? But I remember, I think it's through the art, the mobilization of the way you mentioned, Eng-Beng, about, you know, gender study or Asian study in the academy or African American study. All of them fight so hard to receive the same funding. You talk about neoliberalism. That's the invention of one of their greatest invention. So everybody fights so hard for the same funding pool. Therefore, they become ferocious against one another. It's a disaster. But my hope is this, how we come together like this, that's the beginning of it. Dialogue perpetually, you know. I remember in my talk with Ai Weiwei, our friend Ai Weiwei, you know, he wasn't aware of the fact that June 4th, the Tiananmen Square was a catalyst for his transformation. He's been in New York, nobody even knew who he was. Okay, it's true, he lived in East Village. He got to know, you know, Allen Ginsberg because his father is a famous Chinese poet, was friend of Allen. He followed Jonas Makers everywhere. When you think about his, you know, those Instagram, that came from Jonas, you know, so-called invention of diaristic cinema. We talk deeply about this. But the point I'm saying is that he came back to China and became the Tiananmen Square tankman personification. He took everything from the West to bring back to the East, no more, no less than our other friend, Serena Sapp, who also been educated in America, and took it all back to amplify her own cultural iconography. The woman of Allah is basically for one in what Iqbal Said trying so hard to articulate in his classic Orientalism. So art have a different mobility than it ever had before, visibility. So it's important that somehow we need to support all the visual language as well as written word and all of it in between. But we had to bring it out from the academy. That's the task. We've been failing. The academy, the invention of the Age of Enlightenment again, testing, who do better. Now you get a 2 PhD, you probably going back home and watch video game because there's no job for you. So we understand that, you know, that complexity here. My point is that the more of us come together and talk the way we do, is the better to figure out a way that we can put all of our intellect, our emotion. Intellect without emotion is nothing, and vice versa. You guys know that. You know that beautiful Japanese poem that say, action without vision is a daydream, and vision without action is a nightmare, remember? So I think it's important that we come and talk quite often, very regularly, if I may say that, as much as we can. So it's to be continued because we can't solve the world in 1 hour and a half. You guys know that, you know, it takes a while, you know. But anyway, thank you so much. Let's continue, shall we?
Thank you so much.
Absolutely continue.
Really appreciate
Keep
it.
up the good work.
Thank
Much
you.
love and peace, you guys, and courage.
Fong. And our next comments will come from Irene Shum. And Irene, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Hello. Hi. I'm Irene Shum, and just to quickly identify, I'm a woman of color of East Asian descent and a child of immigrants. I was born and grew up here and I was raised, educated, and worked primarily in white spaces. And so I want to say that I've been actively dismantling my own internalized whiteness in the last, I want to say decade or so. But something I want to, I guess it's hard to follow Fang, but his statement about having these dialogues, I find that for me, this has been the best way to build bridges and to develop empathy and understanding. And and I just wanted to thank the panelists so much for arranging such an important discussion tonight, because I have been very unsettled by the violence, the anti-Asian violence that's been happening. And I guess listening to you all tonight, like one of the things that I realized, I was so unsettled from the Vilma Kari assault in New York City that I did something very unusual, because I'm a art curator. I'm not a political person, but I ended up writing an op-ed that was published in the New York Daily News. But it was about the perpetual nature of Asians being foreigners, and being the perpetual foreigner, even if you are, like myself, born here. And so I think, but a big crux of that essay was really about the history and of Asians in America. And I think that, like another article that I just submitted is about Asian American artists who have become activists as well because of all of the violence of the last year. And there was one person in particular, Mike Keogh, an artist out of Connecticut, but he's been working like in concert with many other people, but pushing education, mandating it into state law in the state of Connecticut, that in addition to, African American studies and, the general, curriculum of public schools, that history, American history, include Asian American history. And I think that that's, for me, I think if people know and you grow up understanding, even if there aren't any Asians in your school district, like I want to say, for example, that would be almost my situation growing up, where my school had maybe a handful of Asians, one Black person, but like learning about other cultures in a real way in a classroom early on, that could be, that could do a lot of work. And I guess it's not so much a question, but I think becoming activists in that, trying to push that through, is one way of fighting or confronting racism. So I would love to know the panelists' thought.
Well, I'll just say something brief. So it's great that that you've been able to kind of shift from just the incredible pain and trauma and triggering that these recent incidences have caused, and the repeated incidences, to actually into action. And that, I think, is incredibly important. So that's so important. And it's also so important because we can kind of look at different moments in which some crazy thing is happening, and people can either retreat or begin to understand the processes of racialization that happen and how it encompasses so many people who thought they were exempt from that process, whether because of class or they weren't Chinese or whatever it may have been. At the same time, I would say that, yes, inclusion has to be part of this, but it's also a fight for a different paradigm of how we tell and understand history. And I think the more we can understand not just settler colonialism, but the formation of the settler state, the white supremacist settler state, but also how neoliberalism itself is a settler colonial paradigm, which then enters into all aspects of the world, including the claims to be able to patent basmati rice. That was really part of a public commons, but then increasingly becomes part and incorporated into the corporate system of profit making. So the paradigm of understanding how these experiences are not simply included into some grand American US historical narrative, but it has to be one that is transformative and can really be part of the liberation that we all desperately need. While also dealing with the reality that this state is here and very powerful. So we have to be able to work that. But thanks for your insights and comments.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that as well by saying that, it's so crucial to think about the Asian American predicament, not as an exceptional one, but as an intersectional and comparative one, so that we might be able to build solidarities and coalitional frameworks for understanding questions of racism in the country. So you're absolutely right in pointing out how the forever foreigner trope, as it applies to Asian Americans, continue to be a huge problem. And in terms of the kinds of educative opportunities at schools, at Dartmouth, for instance, we have no Asian American studies. And right now, I'm directing the Consortium of Studies in Race, Migration, and Sexuality. Rather than taking a corrective approach and installing Asian American studies as a standalone program, which is often the ways in which institutions perform catch up and academic penance for what has not been there. We're trying to imagine a framework, the paradigm that Jack was talking about, that helps us think through Asian American histories and issues as part of the broader questions of race and ethnicity in the US. So in terms of questions of relationalities, comparative racialization, and to think through decolonial and intersectional approaches to these questions, so that it isn't about a singular understanding of Asian American, which is very important in terms of questions of representation, but that's not the only way for us to get at the problem. We need a broader, more coalitional framework so that we understand anti-Asian racism as part of a broader systemic problem in the American project.
So much, and thank you, Irene, for your comments. Let's see. Oh, I see. Thank you. And thank you all for sharing the space with us today. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending with poetry. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of this evening, writer, actor, Mandarin literary translator, and spoken word poet, Enxi Chang, who joins us live from the UK. Her work explores the intersections of queer mixed-race diaspora identity and navigating the world as a Chinese trans woman in a post-COVID world. And Enxi, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me. I'm Enxi Chang, she, her. I'm a writer, actor, spoken word poet, and Mandarin translator from London. Today, I'll be performing my poem, Crying No More. This time last year, I saw Asians in face masks being stared at with hate. And now it's 1 year on, but nothing's changed. Back then, I saw comments and memes saying that this is karma for the Chinese, saying we're an infestation, an invasion. No grief for those who died, just racism disguised as politics. No #pray for Wuhan, just blame, just hate. And that was back then. And I was crying back then. But I'm still crying now because nothing ever changes no matter how loud I shout. I'm still crying for my people who lived 2 centuries of pain. I'm still crying for my people who've been massacred, invaded, and raped. I'm still crying because xenophobia is so ingrained, commonplace, and mundane that I have to explain what that word means every time I say it. Sinophobia definition. The fear, hatred, and discrimination towards China and Chinese people that is so normalized you don't realize or recognize it as you perpetrate, propagate, and engage in it. It makes you hate us. Makes us hate ourselves, erase ourselves, betray ourselves, assimilate ourselves, forget our culture, forget our roots, forget our language, forget our truth. Faceless diaspora, soulless diaspora, bubble tea and complacency, quiet diaspora, silent diaspora, compliant diaspora, out of sight until we're the virus diaspora, long to be white, long to be British, long to be right, long just to fit in, long to be Korean, European, or Japanese, long to be anything as long as it's not Chinese. And so we yearn for the model minority myth, learn to keep our heads down, go about our business. But after all that, when the virus hits, you still get stabbed, beaten, burned, and shoved in a ditch. We're not people. We're not real. It's like our existence is just a newsreel. It's just a debate because we all look the same, an excuse to make a political statement. Because no matter if we're Han, Uyghur, Hong Konger, or Sube, trans, gay, dark skin, light skin, or mixed race, really Chinese lives are nothing more to you than an intellectual exercise or an excuse for Western pride, moral superiority the West needs to survive, hypocrisy that's predicated on lies. There's all this brainwashing so blatant to see. In this light of equal freedom and democracy. Because if the Chinese are brainwashed, but the West rethinking, and I just ask what's been going on with Brexit lately. That's the tragedy of BBC like me. British broadcasting clown the British-born Chinese. EC reduced to nothing but the CCP. Rob the pride, identity, and dignity, but not me. Because when somebody asks me, where are you from? I don't get offended, defensive, and wronged. I say, thanks for asking, I'm from London, but originally China, Dongbei, Xinjiang. It's not rude to me. I'm proud to be Chinese. Proud I'm from Liaoning province in the far northeast, home of Aryan, Zhuan, Job, and Shan An Xinxiang. Don't know what that means? Look it up, Google's free. Turn a tragedy into a comedy, because it's funny how you propagandize being Chinese, because I ain't crying no more. Oh, and one last thing. My name's not Enxi Chang, it's Chang Enxi. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been so fantastic. We're celebrating the Rail's 20th anniversary this year, so as a nonprofit organization, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider making a donation to keeping the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent. And please join us again tomorrow when we're joined by Dia Art Foundation's director, Jessica Morgan, in conversation with Helen Lee and Joaquim Pizarro. We'll conclude with a poetry reading from Andrea Brady. And that will be, as usually, but not always, as proven by tonight's event at 1 p.m. Eastern. Other than that, this has been so fantastic. Thank you all. I really hope there's a second part. And yeah, I'm going to change the security settings for just a moment in an act of faith. And, you can all turn on your microphone and unmute if you'd like and say your goodbyes and felicitations. But this has been truly phenomenal. Hongzhen,
Thank you,
we're
guys.
just so glad you came into our
Thank
orbit.
you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you, everybody.
Many thanks.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bravo, Han
Thank
Hongzhen.
you.
Go see something.
Bravo, Hongzhen.
Our poet is here. Our poet is awake.
Poet is here. I'm so excited.
Oh, come on board.
Hi, poet. And
Oh,
she's
hello.
Hi.
Just played
Hi.
your performance and we were overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed.
Oh, thank you.
It's all right. We played the video, but if you'd like to, say hello or goodbye, that would be great.
Oh, sure. Yeah, because I wasn't sure if I was supposed to perform or not. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Like, I really enjoyed listening to the panel as well. It's really, really interesting. And I think like it's also just like really interesting, like understanding like the history of sort of like what's been going on and sort of how like these things were like how sort of like specifically like how these things operate in sort of like a virtual sphere as well. Because I think like it's definitely something that I've been thinking about as sort of like someone who's like been basically moved all of my life online now. I've still managed to like I've still like not really felt safe recently because of like sort of various things that have happened in my life, and like yeah, like so it's really important that like there's sort of things like this that are being to sort of raise awareness of all this. So yeah. So like yeah, thank you for inviting me, thank you for playing my poetry, and yeah, you can sort of find more of my stuff on my Instagram account, and yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
This is such a silver lining that you dropped by right at the end, and this just works to our favor because it means there has to be a part 2.
Hopefully, it will be a more civilized time for you next time.
Right.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank
should we break for dinner and?
Yes. Thank you all.
Bed.
Bye.
Thank you. Be safe. Thanks so much for joining. Thank you.